90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today we'll be discussing parental alienation and how to prevent it and cope with it. We'll also find out what it is. Our special guest is Dr. Lynn Steinberg. She's a psychologist and an expert witness concerning parental alienation, and she's also the author of the book You're Not Crazy, and she has workshops to help parents prevent and cope with issues of parental alienation. Dr. Steinberg, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
To start us off, just define for our listeners what parental alienation is.
Parental alienation occurs when there is a high conflict, divorce, or separation between the parents, and one parent weaponizes the children against the other parent. So that parent is rejected or eliminated from the child's life. And it gets worse the longer it goes on.
And this weaponization, this could have started long before the divorce, and perhaps
Absolutely.
could be one of the reasons for the divorce.
Yes, oftentimes it is, yes.
And the person who's doing that maybe feel it gives them some joy, or they're, gaining trust or control of the child. But in the end, is that a detrimental approach, especially for the child?
Well, it's actually gaining control over the former spouse, and it's revenge against the former spouse for leaving them. And so they use the children, who generally have a very good relationship with that parent, to turn against that parent, to hurt them and reject, which is devastating for a parent.
And by words or deeds, what are some of the ways they do that?
Well, one way would be to incessantly badmouth a parent. There's a lot of ways to alienate a parent, but just a few ways to alienate that parent, if used enough and strongly enough, can still do the job. So, for example, badmouthing the other parent, making the child afraid of the other parent, making accusations that are false and getting the children to adopt them, getting the children to lie about what happened, having the children be little spies when they go to the other parent's home. There's lots of ways to alienate a parent.
And they may revisit history. They may change history. They may say your father or your mother was always this way, or they did this that hurt you, or they wouldn't let you do this.
Yes. Most of what I do in my clinical practice is go over all the falsehoods that these children have learned about their parent that they've rejected.
And would you say it's a propaganda campaign, almost like one country does against another?
Yeah, I think it's worse than that.
Worse than that.
Parents get so devastated when they're rejected by their beloved child.
And is the child also punished for rejecting those ideas, for showing, saying, Dad is not like that, or I want to spend time with Dad? Will that increase the animosity of the person who's fostering the alienation? It
does, yes. Oftentimes, children will just have their belongings packed in a plastic bag and delivered to the other parent, and they say, here you go, I don't want this child anymore. So there's a lot of consequence for that child.
And are there economic consequences that go along with it, for better or for worse?
There are huge financial loss because the alienating parent will spend their time in court filing one kind of suit against them constantly. And so that parent has to defend themselves. So pretty soon they're financially ruined.
And also, if they're not in joint custody, one parent might lose on the custody front and have to pay more to the other parent, depending on their means, because they have greater custody.
Absolutely, yes. And also, child alimony is paid, or child support is paid. Often they use a parent's former salary. So we know of a case where this mom was a nurse in ICU, so she made quite a bit of money, and they estimated the amount of child support based on what she had made as a nurse, and then proceeded to allow her to lose her license because of the kind of accusation she was facing. And so she didn't have any income, but she was held to the income that was established in the beginning.
And in terms of accusations, does sometimes the animosity get escalated so that one parent makes child abuse or neglect accusations against the other?
I would say probably 99.9% of the time, yes, that does happen. False allegations of abuse, of sexual abuse, of being dangerous with the child.
Or neglect, or just simple neglect.
Neglect, yes.
Educational neglect, medical neglect, custodial supervision neglect.
Yeah, everything's exaggerated.
So this sets up a very bad dynamic for the divorcing couple, for their future interactions with their child. And of course, the world of the child is being shattered even more.
Yes, it's devastating for children.
And is that true for children of any ages? If they see World War III between the parents, whether they're 5 years old or 15 years old, even if they're more independent, does that take a toll on them, and does that toll last?
Well, I think that in, say, normal divorcing parents, it would take a toll on a child to see World War III. But in alienating parents or alienated parents, it's way worse than that, because the child's being dragged into it and they're having to align themselves with the alienating parent against their other parent who did nothing to deserve this.
Except want a divorce or be,
Want to leave, yes.
Right.
Yes, which by the alienating partner is considered abandonment. And they will say, look at your dad or look at your mom, they abandoned us.
And it's us, and it's like an act of war, and it's an act of transgression.
Yes, it's us and the other parent, yes, against the other parent.
And the person tries to align themselves with the child and act in the defense of the child.
Yeah, it's called a pathological alignment.
Okay, so let's for a minute, let's talk about what a good situation will be, the ideal situation, in terms of announcing divorce, taking baby steps toward the divorce, minimizing the physical and emotional changes to the children.
Yeah, I can give you a really good example of an assistant that I had, and she described that her parents were getting a divorce and they knew nothing about it, she and her sister. Then one day the parents sat down with them and said, we're getting a divorce. Dad is moving a few blocks over. He's going to be living with someone new, and you may know her. It's so-and-so. But she's going to be in addition to our family. So you'll have 3 people to take care of whatever you need. And you will go back and forth between our houses, and we've already created a schedule. And this parent will take you to school, and that parent will pick you up. So everything was planned. There was no argument. They did not ask the children to have any say in the situation. And they identified the new person as being very helpful to the children.
Is there a good way to explain the divorce to the children? I mean, maybe the children figured it out already, that the parents just don't get along.
Oh, yeah. The children figure it out right away. They say, oh, are you two going to get a divorce? Are you fighting? You're going to get a divorce. So the children already have it figured out.
Or they may say it's about time, because they realize they may have seen their friends get divorced, and maybe they realize the two parents can no longer get along.
Yes.
With each other. They can still get along as parents and individually with the child.
Right. Yeah. And children very much appreciate what they call the California family, where every new person who comes to the family is considered part of that family, so that they can all get together on holidays and enjoy each other, maybe even go on holiday together.
So they may get the best of both worlds. They may get 2 or 3 parents. They may get parents who can get along for the sake of the children.
Right.
And that the marriage or the parenthood is more functional than it was before.
Exactly. That requires parents who are mature and who are willing to put their children's needs before their own.
For the long term and for the greater good of everyone. And I'd like to remind our listeners, we're talking about parental alienation and the best way to approach it and prevent parental alienation. We're talking with Dr. Lynn Steinberg. She's a psychologist. She also acts as an expert witness and tries to give workshops to help avoid parental and correct parental alienation. And you're listening to Law You Should Know here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, Long Island, New York. If you missed any portion of the program, you want to tell someone else about it, just go to the podcast at nccradio.org. What are some other ways that parents can foster alienation is by failing to agree on educational needs, logistics for the children, their extracurricular activities, conflicts over anything, medical needs, friends, how much time should be devoted to school versus recreational activities versus, say, sports. What are some other areas, and what are the most important areas for parents to get on the same page about?
Well, in the courts will order what they think is a good division in terms of legal custody, where parents have to agree on schools, medical services, whether the kids go to therapy or not. And then they have physical custody, where they agree on how much time each of them is going to have the children, hopefully 50-50. That's the most ideal situation. But in these very high conflict families, everything becomes an issue. So the dysfunctional parent will withhold medical information from the other parent, or school information, or tell the kids to tell that parent not to come to their school activities or sports because they don't want them there. And it just is endless in all the dysfunction.
And they think that will gain them advantage with the child or with the court. If they're the hands-on parent, they're the one in control, they're the one showing care and concern. But they're only hurting the child and preventing that other parent from being a good parent.
Yes, exactly.
And what if parents can't agree on some of the details? Can they, talk to a mediator? If they can't agree on the right religious upbringing, the best school for the child, the best activities, whether some medical issue, what type of intervention, if any, is required, or what degree of medical intervention is required?
Yeah, I think that parents who really put their children's best interests ahead of themselves can and will agree and have a working relationship with one another where the children are concerned. But in these very difficult families where alienation is taking place, pretty much nothing is agreed on.
And this can happen even in a stable marriage where both parents are not getting divorced. There can be conflicts about what the child should be eating, how much time they should spend with their friends, whether they should drive, how much time they should study, what their activities should consist of.
Yeah. As long as it's something that they can end up with some agreement, even if one of them steps out the way because they're saying the other person knows better, then that would be good for the children. But in these families, that's not what happens. One partner will say, oh, your mother, she wants to have control over everything, so I'm just going to let her control your homework situation. Oh, your father, he's not going to tell me anything, so I didn't even know you were going to the doctor.
Now let's talk also about, and I think you describe it as independent thinker phenomenon, where the children adopt one parent's ideas as their own. That may be about what they want to do, or how the other parent is treating them. Is it almost the child is brainwashed?
Yes, they are brainwashed because they have certain memories inserted into their brain. And there's been a lot of research about changing people's memories. And, cults do that kind of thing. They insert new memories into people, and then that person thinks that, they thought that way all along. And that's what alienating parents do to their children.
And how can the other parent try to combat that? And how should the courts be wary of it?
Well, one way, if a parent is still in the marriage with the parent who's doing that, they can try to sit down and say, confront them each time and say, this is what you're doing, and I really don't like it, and we need to go to a marriage therapist because we need to deal with this outside our child's hearing. So they can try to do it that way. But then if they are going to go through with the divorce, the best thing to do is draw up a very specific custody agreement and leave nothing to chance. Like, for example, I mediated a divorce, and the father didn't want to put anything about the custody arrangement for the daughter, and the mother did. And I recommended to them that they be so specific that it would lead to nothing being to chance. So what time are you going to pick the child up? What time do you drop them off? This is the amount of time. What are we going to do if this doesn't happen? And then nip it in the bud if something starts to go awry.
And should there be a little flexibility if one parent is ill, if one parent has a conflict with work or some other responsibilities? Should the other parent say, tough, you've missed your time? Or there should be a little flexibility for the sake of the child?
Well, there is something called right of first refusal. So if one parent's ill or they can't do something, they can call the other parent and ask that parent to step in. If they're functional enough, that other parent will help, and they will make some arrangements to catch up with the time with the child. So that is built into custody arrangements.
And if you're meeting with the child to help evaluate parental alienation to prevent it, what are some of the information you try to enlist from the child to know what might be best for the child, or what zones of control each parent should have, or whether 50-50 custody is appropriate?
Well, there's 3 levels of alienation: mild, moderate, and severe. Severe is when a child is no longer seeing their other parent and they're bad-mouthing the other parent. So when they come into my office, they're calling the other parent Jim or Nancy. They call in their grandparents by their first names. They're belligerent, threatening, acting out, and refuse to sit in the same room with that parent. Oftentimes will take off running. That would be the most severe alienation. A moderate alienation would be when the child is still complying with custody orders, although when children are encouraged to refuse the other parent, they become very entitled. So they think that they can run the show and say when they will see the other parent and when they won't. And then the mild alienation is when there's alienating going on by the alienating parent, but the children are very upset by it because they don't want their beloved parent bad-mouthed. So they're crying when they go into that parent's house that's doing the bad-mouthing. But eventually they will go along with the easiest option, which is to align themselves with the parent it is child abuse to alienate a child against a parent.
Because it's not good for them in the long or the short term.
Well, it's depriving them of a parent.
Right, which is very important to their psychological well-being now and in the future.
Yes, I mean, if a parent dies, there's a lot of people in the community who will step forward and take care of that child. And this is akin to death when a parent is annihilated from a child's life. But there is no community to support that child, or the parent for that matter.
Do you think the courts recognize the dangers of parental alienation?
They are now. It's changed. When I started 10 years ago, they did not want to hear the word alienation. And so I would offer to them, well, would you like me to call it coercive control? Because there are laws against coercive control, domestic violence, psychological abuse, emotional abuse. What would you like me to call it? Because I can use any of those names when I speak about it. Now they don't object to the words parental alienation.
And some people who were children of divorce from that period, from longer ago, where before it was fully recognized, do they sometimes have lingering issues and as adults and future parents themselves?
Yes, and this is actually a generational issue. When children are alienated, they will often pick a partner who will also be alienating them. So tragically, they're not only the alienated child, but they become the alienated parent.
And what do you mean by they'll pick a partner who will be alienated?
I think that when there's unresolved issues in childhood, whoever the child has the most unresolved issues with, they will pick a partner in order to keep resolving those issues. Of course, that never works out, and there is a divorce. That's why I think the divorce statistic is as high as it is, instead of picking a partner who, is reasonably well put together, because they keep trying to resolve that.
I'd just like to remind our audience, we're talking with Dr. Lynn Steinberg. She's a psychologist, and she's an expert on parental alienation, and we're talking about preventing parental alienation. And we've talked about, some of the ways the impact it has on a divorce or beyond divorce. Dr. Steinberg, just tell us about your book, You're Not Crazy, and what are some of the related topics you cover there?
Well, I named the book that because alienated parents feel like they are crazy. Here they had this loving child that they couldn't wait to see when they got home, spent a lot of time with, and all of a sudden that child is calling them names, refusing to spend time with them, and they feel crazy. They feel like they did something wrong. And then when they go to court, they're faced with a lot of false accusations, supposedly from the child, but in reality from the other parents. And they don't know what to do. And very often their misdiagnosis at that point is having a personality disorder like borderline personality. But in actual fact, they're scared, they're angry, they're anxious, and they don't present very well. They present as sort of hysterically.
This is the child or the parent?
This is the parent.
The parent, okay.
Yeah. And so my book is about these are the things that happen in parental alienation. This is what it is. These are the signs. This is how you can resolve it. This is how you pick a therapist. This is how you pick a lawyer. If you're going to represent yourself in court, this is the way to do it. Here are the forms, how you fill them out, what you need to do. So it demystifies the whole process of fighting against alienation.
So it's important for the court to understand and to evaluate the psychological and dynamics of the marriage, the divorce, and the relationship between the child and each parent.
Yes, it is important, but it doesn't happen because the family courts are not equipped to evaluate these kind of relationships. Somehow or other, it's going to have to go back to qualified individuals and not mediators because they're not qualified, but psychologists who have had training and recognize the signs. And in fact, we're trying to change the law right now to mandate training for judges, lawyers, therapists, teachers, whoever works with children, to be able to recognize these dynamics and get it treated, nip it in the bud, have centers where you can go for treatment, because right now we don't have those.
And very briefly, you touched on it before, but you also mentioned some of the dynamics in manipulating the child could be confiding in a child, getting a child to spy on the other parent, and in a sense, weaponizing the children to use them as leverage in the divorce and in trying to manipulate child custody.
Yes. That's what the alienating parent does.
And it's very bad down the road. It's very bad at that time and down the road for the child.
Very much. Children suffer career-wise, school-wise, in every way, psychologically, eating disorders, substance abuse.
And even in their relationships as they become adults.
Yes.
And get married.
Definitely, yes.
Dr. Steinberg, just tell us your website and some of the information available to listeners on your website.
My website address is Lynn, Lynn, Steinberg, STEINBERG.com. And I talk about what's happening legislatively, how people can help, what kind of templates you can give judges so they can just sign for the treatment, because they really don't know what to do. And
Dr. Steinberg, what do you also cover in your workshops for parents going through a divorce and trying to prevent parental alienation?
It's a 4-day intervention. We meet for 6 hours a day, 6 to 8 hours a day. All the children in the family come and the alienated parent. And the first process is to re-empower the parent so that they become the parents again and not just Jim, who the kids don't want to see. We talk about false allegations. I talk about memory and how it's unreliable and can be inserted in the person. And I have a video that talks about the various aspects of alienation, which is oriented toward children. And then I have them talk about how they might identify with something like that. So at the end of the 4 days, they have a very good picture of what they went through, and that they are now going to be living with their alienated parent. We get a court order for that.
I would like to thank our special guest, Dr. Lynn Steinberg, for being our guest on Law You Should Know and discussing preventing parental alienation and why it's something lawyers, judges, and parents should be aware of if they go through the divorce process. It's important they resolve these issues in a positive way for their children. If you've missed any portion of the program or you want to tell someone else about it, the podcast is available, along with many other podcasts about the law, at nccradio.org. Please join us next week at this same time on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, Long Island, New York.